All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison. I'm a senior enterprise advocate at GitHub, where I focus in on trying to help enterprises get up and running with DevOps. And one of the big areas that we focus in on is this little thing called InnerSource. And in a nutshell, InnerSource is taking the open source community lessons behind your firewall and applying that to the development that you're doing in-house. So let's start by defining some terminology here. What is InnerSource? And I think a great way to actually get into it is to take a look at a quote from a developer, from a senior engineer at IBM, who says, "We see InnerSource as a way to improve efficiency through code reuse. But even beyond that, it's an amazing conduit for learning and exchanging ideas and facilitating innovation within IBM." So it sounds pretty powerful, and as it turns out, it is. So what is InnerSource and why InnerSource? Well, InnerSource is applying the learnings and methodologies from open source to internal development. That when we think about open source projects, we're thinking about large numbers of people that are going to be geographically dispersed, that are all going to be coming together, contributing at different times, different amounts, to make some really cool products. And those are techniques, those are skills, those are learnings that can actually help us, even when we're maybe all a bit more like in the same building or in the same time zone or all pointed towards the same direction, that there's a lot of learnings that we can still apply. And the reason for that is because InnerSource is going to encourage your developers to contribute not just to their own projects, but to other projects inside your organization, which is going to, in turn, help promote sharing and reuse of resources, which at the end of it all is going to enhance productivity. Now, this being a lightning talk, I've got about 10 minutes. I'm not going to be able to hit all of the key components of InnerSource. We could actually go on for quite a bit longer. So instead, I want to focus in on three main areas, three that are hopefully going to be relatively actionable by your organization so you can start down this path. And that's going to be defaulting to open repositories, PRing the change that you want to see, encouraging more pull requests, and to start working more asynchronously. So let's start by defaulting to open repositories. When we think about open source, we of course think about open. I mean, it's right there in the name. It's relatively hard for the general public to be able to contribute to a private repository. Yet so often inside of our organizations, when we create a brand new repository, that repository is going to be limited to just that team, to just that project. And that's inherently limiting because now only that team is going to be able to contribute to that. Only that team is going to be able to take advantage of the resources that are inside of there. Only that team is going to be able to learn the lessons that have been learned as part of that project. There's a buddy of mine who likes to say, we're not launching rockets here. And the point that he's making when he says that is whatever it is that we're doing, chances are somebody else has already done that. So let's take advantage of the components that have already been built rather than going off and building a new one all on our own. And when we think about internal development, when we think about the development that we're going to be doing, we're frequently using the same sets of business rules, the same services, accessing the same data. So why is it that we should have each team go off and create their own implementation, their own components that could be readily shared throughout the rest of the organization? So one big shift that we want to make is to default to open repositories, that rather than looking for an excuse to open up a repository, we should be looking for a reason to close that off instead. Internally at GitHub, all of our projects, all of our repositories are by default open to the organization and are only closed down or only made private when there happens to be some particular business need or other requirement that would require that to be locked down. So make your repositories open. That's going to allow for better reuse. It's going to allow for better searching. And in turn, it's going to allow for more useful packages, which leads me perfectly into the next big part of InnerSource. PR pull request, the change that you want to see. If you're not already familiar with a pull request is basically somebody saying, hey, I've got some bit of code. I would like you to pull this into the code that you have. In the open source community, pull requests are encouraged. That's the lifeblood of an open source project. In fact, many open source projects will even have issues that will have a flag as good for beginners or good for your first PR, because we want to encourage people to contribute. And one of the things that I always like to say, and I'm not getting political here, but it's still, I think, applicable, is complaining about something is relatively easy. Coming up with a solution is not only more difficult, but it's actually meaningful. The same thing holds true here. Filing an issue, saying, hey, this package doesn't do what I want it to do or doesn't behave in the way that I expect it should, that's relatively easy. It's easy to complain. But taking that next step and going, hey, I now want to fix this. I want to now add the code to add in that behavior, to change this, to enhance this. That's not only going to, take a little bit more effort, but it's also in turn going to create for a better project. It's going to create for a better component. Additionally, teams do tend to get tunnel visioned, that you have a set of developers that are working on one project, that are doing one thing, and they're not necessarily always thinking about how other teams might be able to take advantage of that. So by allowing for different people from different teams to PR, you're going to wind up with better code, you're going to wind up with better components because you'll have gotten more voices in. This is something I know that happens quite a bit inside of Microsoft, where they really encourage cross-pollination between teams. Taking that to the next level is encouraging PRs from across your organization. So rather than an individual team owning the code, everybody owns the code. Foster an environment in which PRs are encouraged. And remember that not every PR needs to be merged, that we want to encourage people to suggest changes to our code to actually make those PRs. And finally, when we think about open source, we're going to have contributors that are not only geographically spread out, but maybe they're contributing at different times of the day, that maybe this is a little side project that they're working on. And the way that I like to summarize this is that instant messaging does not mean instant replies. This actually goes back to something a coworker of mine said back in 2017. I had sent him a message on ICQ. About an hour had gone by and I hadn't heard back from him. And I did the unthinkable, put my head up over his cube and said, hey, did you get my message? And he looked back up at me and said, Christopher, instant messaging does not mean instant replies. And 17 years later, that phrase, that sentence is still so relevant and probably even more so today than it was then, when we think about all of the different ways that we can communicate with our developers. In the open source community, Development is asynchronous, that we want to free up our developers to be able to do what they do best, to develop, to write code, and that we want to eliminate any barriers. Now, I've talked already about barriers being messaging, but it does, of course, go beyond that, that if there are tests to run, if there are processes that need to be executed, we want to make sure that as much of that is as automated as possible. Because once that flow is gone, it's gone. Every single one of us has experienced this, that on average, it takes about 23 minutes for a developer to get back into the groove. And for somebody like myself who has ADHD, it can take me even longer if that bit of focus winds up being broken. So we want to do everything that we can to reduce those blockers, to automate tasks, to reduce synchronous messaging, to allow developers to write code and to work asynchronously. So based on that, how can we start to apply that? That I mentioned at the very beginning, we could take a couple of hours and talk about InnerSource. I wanted to focus in on a couple of things that are hopefully actionable by most organizations. So where do we go from here? The first thing is try to identify some existing repositories that you could open up. Any components, packages that are being shared out across the organization, that's a great first place to start. And then from there, encourage all developers, not just to file issues, but to also submit PRs. Normalize turning off notifications. It's okay to close Slack. It's okay to close Teams. There is actually, by the way, a little bit of science to show that even seeing the notification, even if you don't see the dialogue pop up, just seeing that little number, that can also be a distractor. Normalize turning those off. And then last but not least, when you decide that you really want to go fully into InnerSource, find an appropriate team project that you can pilot this on, start to apply these methodologies, and then grow out to the rest of your organization from there. If you want to learn more, there's plenty of information that's available on GitHub that you can go ahead and check out. Got the QR code down there at the lower right. And I want to thank everybody for their time. That is InnerSource. That's a couple of learnings that hopefully you'll be able to apply to your organization. Thank you.